Welcome, everybody. This is the Order of the Seder series 2024 for Web Yeshiva. I'm Uri Cohen. This topic is Urchatz, which is the second step of the standard Seder. Kadesh, meaning say Kiddush. Urchatz, wash your hands. I want to thank Rav Menachem Kluperman, the Rav of my shul in Ramat Beit Shemesh. The shul is Kilat Avat Zion for his help. He sent me his source sheet and his notes on the subject. And there's an excellent article that we will see on the source sheet by Rabbi Yehuda Spitz of Or Sameach that pulls together the material, or pulls together more material than anybody else I've seen. Although the way I'm going to present it is a little bit different. This is not of all the Seder topics. I don't think Web Yeshiva gave everybody a choice. It was more like, would you like to do this topic? Okay. Probably if they asked teachers to choose their favorite Seder topic, it would not be Urchatz. And the reason, well, you could say it doesn't seem to be that relevant or that interesting. It is a little bit different from the other topics, from the other steps of the Seder. As I'm going to suggest, there is a classic explanation for why we wash our hands in between Kiddush and Karpas, and we'll discuss that issue. But I'm going to show some classic Achronim, rabbis from the last few hundred years, arguing that that's not the real reason, and that rather it's something else. And I didn't know that at all before preparing this topic. In fact, here's the summary of what we're going to do right now. We will briefly look at how the Shulchan Aruch says to do Urchatz. That's going to be source number one. Then we will do, again, very briefly, but Shulchan Aruch and Mishnah Berurah on washing the hands for bread, or matzah, as the case may be, on Pesach. That's standard Netilat Yadayim, and we'll compare that with what's the standard explanation of Urchatz, the Netilat Yadayim, washing hands for wet food. Because when you dip the Karpas, that's one of the necessary things you're supposed to do with Karpas. You take a vegetable and you dip it. The first of the two dippings. It's very important because one of the 4 questions in the Manishtana says, why do we dip twice? So you have to dip twice. If you're dipping, then already this halacha about washing your hands before eating wet food seems to kick in. When you dip, it makes the Karpas a wet food. Okay, that will be the classic explanation. We'll go through that again briefly because this has to do with Tuma, impurity, and Tahara, purity, and I don't know about you, but I don't know that much about it. It's not that practical, and it's a little bit hard to relate to. We'll touch on it, but within that standard approach, we'll see that there's a debate whether or not to say bracha on Urchatz, which you might find surprising because the way your Urchatz is usually presented, like at the Seder, okay, what do we do now? Now, everybody, let's go wash our hands and don't say the bracha. Don't say the blessing. So presumably it's very important to not say the blessing, and that's not made up. We'll see that's the approach of the Shulchan Aruch, but there's a debate about it. And we'll also mention the custom that some people have, or used to have, in which only the Seder leader does Urchatz, which will be puzzling in light of the classic explanation, which would seem to be that it's required for everybody who's going to dip the food required to wash the hands. We will pose the question why Urchatz is still done today, according to all the approaches except for one. That one says you do it because you have to. It's very simple. But according to all the other approaches, that's not the full explanation. And we're going to give 7 answers. They can be divided into 2 types. 3 answers that will try to tie into the classic explanation, or rather, 1 answer that is the classic explanation and 2 variations on it. And then we'll give 4 answers that are out of the box, but they're still presented by rabbinic authorities. that's what we are going to do. I'll mention briefly, just in light of what do people know about Urchatz. There is, second, let me share my screen, optimize for motion and video. There is a there's a humor video from several years ago, 11 years ago, huh? In which a guy in a yeshiva composed a kind of low production values rap song called the Avera song, Avera meaning sins, and every line of the song he boasts that he's doing something wrong on purpose. So I'm just going to play 2 lines of this song, and then we'll look briefly at the lyrics of the song, then we'll get back to the real sources.
My esrig is always full of black dots. I always make a bruche when I wash Urchatz.
Okay, it's okay if you didn't get that. What he just said was, my esrog is always full of black dots, and I always make a bracha when I wash Urchatz. In other words, he does everything wrong on purpose. So how do you do Urchatz wrong? You do Urchatz wrong by making a bracha. As we're going to see, it's not as wrong as this guy thinks, but I thought it was amusing that somebody on Sefaria put together a source sheet. Actually, 2 people on Sefaria put together a source sheet based on this song. One of them is simply a list of the lyrics, and each one has a hyperlink to a source that relates to that halacha. And there's also a different source sheet, which you could find without too much difficulty, in which every single line of the song is followed by a source about it. So some people just can't get enough of making sense out of everything. Anyway, I thought that was amusing, especially when you see, as we will see shortly, that it's not so clear that we should not say bracha on Urchatz. Actually, let me share one more thing before we look at the Shulchan Aruch. Open and share. 1 second. Share content. Here we go. This is a page from the one of my favorite Haggadahs, the Passover Haggadah graphic novel, which I'm holding here, by Jordan Gorfinkel and Erez Tzadok. One or both of them went on to do the graphic novel. We call it Esther. It's a little late to get that this year, but I just wanted to briefly show how they present the goats, the Chad Gadya, the goats that explain everything in this graphic novel Haggadah. I thought they did a pretty good job. Everyone rinses their hands with a cup, wash at a sink, or at the table with 2 basins, one for taking clean water and the other for collecting the used water. Lots of Haggadahs don't have that. They don't tell you how to do that. Pour water from the cup over each hand, first your right and first your left. Notice it doesn't say to do it twice on each hand or 3 times on each hand. As we'll see, there's a reason for that. That's solidly based. And here's the explanation. This is how our ancestors made their hands ritually pure before beginning the meal. No blessing, because this ritual rinsing is only a commemoration. Later, we will say one, meaning a blessing, over the ritual rinsing for the matzah. So that's actually going to tie into probably answer number 3, but that is solidly based. Let's look at the way it's formulated in the Shulchan Aruch. Source number 1, Notel Yadav L'Tzarach Tibul Rishon. This is after doing Kiddush at the Seder. You wash your hands with the cup, that's Notel Yadav. L'Tzarach Tibul Rishon, for purposes of the first dipping. V'lo yivarach al hanatila. Do not say a blessing. Do not say Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu haolam asher kiddushan b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al natilat yadayim. We will say that later before we eat them, when we wash our hands before the matzah. That's a separate step of the Seder called rachza. Bikach me'akarpas. take of the vegetable, which we're not going to address right now. Somebody else is giving a whole class about it at Web Yeshiva, so I wouldn't want to step on their toes. Take a little of the karpas, pachot mikazayit, less than the size of an olive, which I'll just mention briefly because this is not our topic, but because there's a question within Karpas whether you're going to need to repeat the Borei Pri Adama, blessing on the vegetable, much later when you eat the maror. So the Shulchan Aruch follows the opinion that if you eat just a little bit of kazayit, less than a kazayit of the Karpas, then your bracha of Borei Pri Adama will be able to apply much later in the Seder to the maror. Not everybody agrees on this. The Rambam, for example, says you eat a kazayit. Well, in general, whenever you're supposed to eat something in halacha, it's a kazayit. Okay, the Shulchan Aruch has a specific reason in this case. Umetablo, you dip it bechometz in vinegar. In case you're wondering, that's following the Rambam. It's more standard these days to do salt water. And I'll just point out in passing that when he says vinegar, he assumes that it's red wine vinegar, or else it wouldn't fit with what we're going to get to about the halacha about of dipping. Umevarach, you say the bracha of Borei Pri Adama ve'ochel, and you eat. Ve'ena mevarach acharav, you do not say the standard bar nefasha. Okay, that's washing for karpas. The question is, how does this netilat yadayim, washing the hands formally, meaning ritually with a cup, but without a blessing, how does this fit in with the more standard netilat yadayim, which we do when we eat bread? And the short answer is, it is different. It's different because even though both washing the hands for bread and washing the hands for wet food, they're both mentioned in the Gemara and the Shulchan Aruch, they're for different reasons. Let's look briefly at a couple of the halachot in the Shulchan Aruch about regular netilat yadayim. Kishiyavo le'achol pat, when you're about to eat bread, shmevarchenu av hamotzi, kind of bread that hamotzi is relevant for, yitol yadav, wash your hands with the cup. Even if, as far as you're aware, your hands are not impure. This is a kind of anachronistic for us because we don't follow the laws of Tumah and Tara without the temple today. But in any case, you wash the hands, you say the bracha of Anat Yadayim. This is what I want to point out, the very next part. Yesh mi she'omer, some say, Rav Karo of the Shulchan Aruch quotes, some say, if the amount of bread you're about to eat in your meal, this could be Shabbat, it could be a weekday, the whole year, if the amount of bread you're going to eat is less than the size of an egg, the size of an egg in halacha is twice the size of an olive in halacha, a kazayit. Yitol yadav, if you're going to eat less than that, yitol yadav, you still have to wash your hands, v'lo yivarech, do not say the bracha of Anat Yadayim. A lot of halachically observant Jews don't know this one, meaning many halachically observant Jews think that netilat yadayim means you wash your hands twice for bread, twice on each hand. You say the bracha and then you say the motzi. That's correct according to Shulchan Aruch if you're going to eat like what, 3 pieces of bread, 4 pieces of bread, a lot of bread, whatever is the twice the size of an olive. If you think an olive is very small, then presumably this applies all the time. But according to the Shulchan Aruch, anyway, if you're going to eat less than that, then you still wash, but you don't make a bracha. Why do you not make a bracha? Because there's a debate whether the requirement of netilat yadayim applies if you're eating less than a kazayit. If you're eating less than a kibetza of bread. Therefore, the compromise is, according to Shulchan Aruch, you wash your hands and you don't make a bracha. This will be a precedent for what Rav Karo is going to say about Urchatz. And then he says, what if imochel pachot mikazayit? What if you're sure you're going to eat less than an olive size of bread? Yesh mi she'omer, there's an opinion that says, she'ein tzarich netilah, you don't have to wash your hands at all. Wow. I don't think that is taught so much, but it seems pretty explicit from the Shulchan Aruch. Notice he says in both cases, Bet and Gimel, he says some say, but he doesn't say the other opinion. The other opinion is presumably the opposite. but he doesn't actually bring it. These are presumably the opinions that he thinks are correct. You need to wash your hands for bread, at least if you're going to eat a kazayit, and if you're going to eat a kibetza, then you also say the bracha of Anatiot Yadayim. But Nitilat Yadayim and the bracha of Anatiot Yadayim don't always go together. The Mishnah Berurah standard Ashkenaz halachic posek, halachic decisor, gives a quick summary, which we're not even going to go through here. I'll summarize his summary about why there's an obligation to wash your hands ritually before eating bread. He quotes the two Gemaras that relate to it. One of them says it's because of srach truma. Srach is something relating to, it's not exactly truma. What do you mean? We don't have truma anymore. Well, you're supposed to take off truma and be when you have produce, but you don't give it to the Kohen, which is the original halacha. You give it to the Kohen and the Kohen eats it and no one else is allowed to eat it. No, we burn the truma, we burn the challah, because since we assume that we know who's a Kohen, but we don't know for sure. And since eating truma or challah, if you're not definitely a Kohen, means that you're guilty of the death penalty, at least from heaven. Therefore, we really want to avoid that. Therefore, as long as we're not sure who's a Kohen, we take off the challah or the truma, but we don't actually give it to the Kohanim. What does that have to do with Nitilat Yadayim? The idea was, this is the Mishnah Berurah is basically paraphrasing the Gemara. During the time that truma was of the temple, during the time that truma was given to the Kohanim, it was very important for Kohanim to wash their hands ritually and remove the tumah, the impurity, before eating the truma. It was very important, or else it would mess up the truma. The rabbis made a decree that in order to make sure that Kohanim, when there's a Beit HaMikdash, when there's a temple, and there's truma that's being eaten by Kohanim, in order to make sure that Kohanim will be in the habit of washing their hands, for truma, everybody has to wash their hands whenever they make a meal out of bread. That's the one of the two reasons why we wash our hands for bread. Most people are not Kohanim. I'm a Kohen, but most people are not Kohanim, and we don't have a Beit HaMikdash, and therefore a lot of people, when they teach this topic, don't even bring up this reason at all, because you want to inspire people to do it, not to say, well, there's a reason that we don't really apply today. That's why lots of people quote the other Gemara instead, which is quoted here in this Mishnah Berurah, which is that it's for Kedusha. Washing your hands before making a meal out of bread is for holiness. And the Gemara quotes a pasuk, B'it kadishtem v'hiyitem kedoshim. We're going to read this in Parshat Kedoshim, if I remember correctly, in a few weeks. You should make yourselves holy and be holy. And the Gemara says, make yourselves holy, that's before the meal. And be holy, that's after the meal. And which is, if you think about it, a very nice idea. How do we remind ourselves that eating, which is a physical thing, is supposed to be elevated? We're supposed to eat as not just people with a body who have an appetite, but people who want to turn every action, every physical action, to something spiritual. So part of the way we do that is we say a bracha. We say a blessing before we eat and after we eat, and that's true. But the other part is when we eat seriously, meaning we have a meal which is formulated by the rabbis as eating more than a little bit of bread, then we formalize the meal by washing our hands ritually before and after. Before is what we call Netilat Yadayim. After is called Mayim Achronim. In case you see anybody doing Mayim Achronim, chances are that, assuming that they're familiar with it, chances are that the main reason that they think, I'd like to think, that they are doing Mayim Achronim, not everybody agrees that it's still required, but for the opinion that says it's no longer required says, oh, it's because of something with some salt that we don't have anymore. But the opinion says, no, it's still relevant, follows this Gemara, which is you're supposed to sanctify the meal by washing your hands before and washing your hands after. There are one or two other reasons to do Mayim Achronim, but this is for our purposes. I'll just mention briefly, because I want to get back to the main subject, that the Mishnah Berurah explains why if you eat less than a kibetza of bread, you don't make the bracha of Anatilat Yadayim, according to the Mechaber. That's because that if you eat less than that amount of bread, that that small amount of bread cannot become tameh. In other words, some of the rules of Netilat Yadayim for bread are based on the original rules of purity. And the Sha'ar Tzion points out, that's the notes written by the Chavetz Chaim on his own Mishnah Berurah, points out that the Vilna Gaon, the Gra, thinks that this halacha is not correct. Everybody who says Netilat Yadayim all the time when they're going to eat just a basic, an olive size of bread, they're following the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon says, no, you have to wash your hands and say the bracha, even if you're not going to eat the double amount, the kibetza, even if you're just going to eat the kazayit, you still say the bracha. Okay, so I don't want to say that people are doing something wrong. I see that someone asked about, do you need mikveh for truma? No, this is actually a special set of halachot about the impurity of the hands. And there's really a lot to talk about, but the impurity of the hands is why the rabbis required hand washing for washing the hands specifically for truma, first of the kohanim, then for everybody else to wash the hands before eating bread. Now here's the part that they don't teach you in school because we don't do it anymore. That is Netilat Yadayim and possibly a bracha when you're eating wet food. This Gemara appears in the same place in the Gemara that talks about Karpas. In other words, in the context of you're about to eat a wet vegetable. P.S. The Gemara says, Kol shetibul b'mashke, everything, literally every type of food that you're going to dip in a liquid, we'll define liquid momentarily, needs hand washing first. And it's not debated in the Gemara, which is why it's in the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch, see in source number 6, Siman Kuf Nun Chet Sif Daled. Okay, there's a reason why I formulated it here on this page in this way, because what we were just looking at in source number 2, these are literally the next words in the same part of the Shulchan Aruch. It talks about washing the hands for bread and then goes on to washing the hands for wet stuff. There's not some obscure thing. It's in the Shulchan Aruch. Same Shulchan Aruch who says you have to wash your hands for bread says you have to wash your hands for wet food. And here's the way it formulates it. Im ochel davar, if you eat food, shetibulo, which has been dipped, be'echad me'shiva mashkin, one of 7 types of liquid, which we're not going to explain, but I'll just list. There's a memory device, yad shachat dam, which doesn't make any sense. Hand slaughtered blood. What does that mean? It doesn't mean anything. That's why you remember it, because it's silly. But what are the liquids? Yayin, wine, davash, honey, that's bee honey, shemen, oil, meaning olive oil, chalav, milk, tal, dew, dam, meaning blood, which, P.S., you're not allowed to eat anyway, and mayim, and water. So that's why I pointed out that when the Shulchan Aruch says you dip the karpas in vinegar, he assumes that it's red wine vinegar, because if it were not red wine vinegar, you would have a problem that maybe it's not one of the 7 it is not one of the 7 liquids. Anyway, if you dip food in one of the 7 liquids where the moisture has gotten on it, well, you washed your apple, whatever, velo nit nagev, and it has not been dried. If you dried it, then this doesn't apply. But if you dried it, then no good, even if your hands picking up the food are not going to touch the wet part, it doesn't matter. Tzarich netiwa, you're obligated to wash your hands below bracha, but without a blessing. See, question: isn't regular non-wine vinegar diluted with water? Would that be a reason to wash? I guess that would be the question. How much water? I'm sure somebody talks about it. How much water is it diluted with, and how much counts as how much of a liquid has to be water in order to have it count as water? I'm sure that's addressed. So the Mishnah Berurah says, why does the Shulchan Aruch, unlike with bread, where he says you make a bracha on Netilat Yadayim if you're going to eat a kibetza worth of bread, a kibetza volume of bread, but on the washing for wet food, he says you have to do it, but he says you do not make a bracha, period. Why? The Mishnah Berurah explains there, because it's a debate among the Rishonim. Most Rishonim say, actually, I'll formulate the way that he does here. There are a few Rishonim, I would say several Rishonim, but still a minority, who say that the only reason why the rabbis required netilat yadayim for wet food that was biyamehem. That was in their days. Shehayu ochlim b'tara, because they would eat their food with purity, and therefore, in order to get purity, you would have to wash your hands, which is not the case nowadays in the Middle Ages, and certainly nowadays, kuanu tmei meitim, we're all already considered impure for most purposes. It's not going to make any difference. Notice that he doesn't spell this out here, but some of those Rishonim say, so really, you don't have to wash before eating a wet vegetable. Shulchan Aruch doesn't like that opinion, but he wants to take into opinion the variation that says you still have to wash your hands, but you don't say the bracha. Actually, let's formulate it this way. Some say you don't need to do it at all, and some say you need to do it with a bracha. So there's a better way to formulate it. Safik brachot lahakel, whenever there's a debate about whether to say a bracha or not, we are lenient, which in practice means we do not say the bracha. And then Mishnah Berurah quotes the Magen Avraham and the Lechem Chamudot, two Achronim who say it's not just that there's a debate, but ha'olam noagim, olam meaning a few hundred years ago when these commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch were written, the custom is we, meaning halachically observant Jews, we do not wash our hands for wet food. They have an opinion to rely on, which is the minority of Rishonim. Since the majority of Rishonim and lots of Achronim say, what do you mean? This rule still applies. You have to do it. Okay, so they'll be strict to not say the bracha. Again, we're not talking about Pesach yet. We're talking about all year round. You eat wet food, you're obligated, according to this opinion, you're obligated to wash your hands. Okay, it's a debate. Some say you don't have to. But since the majority opinion says you do have to, so you have to do it. Oh, you don't say the bracha because there's a debate whether you have to do it or not. And then the Mishnah Berurah quotes something in passing from the Pri Megadim, one of the major Achronim commentaries on the back of the Shulchan Aruch. But tzarich was a kol dinei netilah kamo lepat. And it would seem that when you wash your hands for wet food, you're obligated to follow all the rules of netilat yadayim with the cup and presumably twice on each hand, and all sorts of requirements. You can't have a bandage on your hand. Lots of requirements. Presumably the same thing applies when you're washing your hands for wet food. We're going to see shortly that not everybody agrees on that. And then the Mishnah Berurah concludes, but what if you're eating less than a kazayit of the wet food? It seems to me clear, meaning he doesn't have great sources for it, but that's his opinion, the Chafetz Chaim's opinion. Don't be strict, meaning you don't have to wash your hands for wet food if it's less than a kazayit. Why? Because even for bread, a bunch of opinions say you don't have to wash your hands at all if it's less than a kazayit. The Shulchan Aruch says, some say you don't have to, so, and that's the stricter rule. So this is the less strict rule for sure. If you're eating only a little piece of food that's wet, you would not be obligated to wash your hands. An interesting idea I just mentioned in passing from the Griz, Rav Yitzchak Zev Soloveitchik. He was the uncle of Rav Yosef Dov Halevi Soloveitchik. Rav Soloveitchik lived in Boston. This rabbi lived here in Israel, and the Soloveitchik family in Israel is connected to him in the Haggadah called Haggadah Shel Pesach Mi Beit Levi, not to be confused with the Haggadah Beit Halevi, different book. Says that this is the Rav Soloveitchik, who's Rav Yitzchak Zev Soloveitchik, known as Rav Elvel, said this about Urchatz, but not because of the Seder per se, just that when you wash your hands for a wet vegetable, you don't have to do 2 pourings on each hand. And in fact, you don't even need to use a revi'it of water. Revi'it is not that much, 3 ounces, 4 ounces, whatever, but usually one of the standard rules for washing your hands for bread is you can't use a tiny bit of water. You need to cover your hands with the water, okay? And Rav Elvel says, actually, even though you're obligated to wash your hands for wet food, you don't have to follow all the rules for that washing as for washing for bread, which is, in other words, he's disagreeing with the Pri Megadim that we just quoted a minute ago. Why? Because this washing is mishum tahara. It's for purity, meaning not for holiness, but for purity. V'domeh tevilah b'mikvah. It's comparable to dipping in a mikveh, not comparable in the sense of all the many details, because this is just your hands, but the idea is that it's presumably it's to remind you of purity. It's not literally like dipping in a mikveh, but it's more like dipping in the mikveh, which is to get purity, as opposed to washing hands for bread, which is for holiness. So anyway, I'm just mentioning in passing that even before we get to Urchatz, there are already a couple of debates about washing the hands for the wet food. Now, the Mechaber, Rav Karo, said, we started this with source number 1, is you wash your hands at the Seder Urchatz, you do not make a bracha. It turns out that even though that's solidly based, it's not a problematic opinion, but you should be aware that it used to be hundreds of years ago, was more standard to make a bracha on Urchatz. I'm holding up the JPS, Jewish Publication Society, commentary on the Haggadah by Professor Yosef Tabori. He has a couple of pages. It's very good historical overview in English of every part of the Seder, and it's a pretty it's a small enough book you can bring it to the Seder. It's not one of these like 600 pages. It's only about 150 pages. So he points out that it used to be there was a bracha on Urchatz. We find it, or it was found, in French, German, and Spanish communities in Yemen, and also in ancient China when Jews lived in China. Objecting to the bracha over Urchatz is first found in the writings of the students of the Maharami Rotenberg, Rav Meir of Rothenburg, one of the major Ashkenazi Rishonim. I didn't bring the quote here, but he's quoted in a bunch of Ashkenazi Rishonim as saying, no, he himself did not recite the bracha. Why? So we already saw this quote in the Mishnah Berurah. The washing was obligatory only when we had the rules of food purity. So it's not that the Maharami Rotenberg said, don't wash your hands at the Seder. You do wash your hands. Question is why? We'll get to that shortly, but the washing your hands is not for the original reason, because the original rule does not apply anymore. Nevertheless, Professor Tabori points out the blessing survived for many years. It is found in the Haggadah printed in Prague in 1527, even some later editions. Since then, it has disappeared. Asterisk, not completely. Certain Haggadahs that follow the Vilna Gaon say that you should say the bracha, because the Vilna Gaon says that you're obligated to say the bracha, which we're going to skip this now from part of the article, which I mentioned above, that I recommend, by Rabbi Yehuda Spitz. Compares two different opinions of the Lavush and the Gra. We're going to see the Lavush shortly, but not this particular point. In light of what we just saw, if the reason for doing Urchatz is because you have to wash your hands before eating wet food, and maybe you don't have to wash your hands anymore, but it's still part of the Seder, well then, how could it be that there is a custom? Apparently, it's not as common these days as it used to be, but it used to be relatively common in some Ashkenazic circles that, as formulated here in the Weket Yosher in source number 12, he says, I found this in old Machzorim. Yitol habaki et yadav, the expert, the leader, washes his hands. And he tries to understand why there would be such a thing. Wait, I don't understand. At a regular meal, when you're eating bread, or on Pesach, you're eating matzah, everybody who is about to eat the bread needs to wash their hands. It's a personal obligation. And in general, if you're doing something that relates to food, you can't have somebody eat it for you. You have to eat the karpas yourself, so you have to wash your hands yourself. It's very weird. It turns out that this has been debated going back to the 1400s. Source number 11, 3 important rabbis, German rabbis of the 1400s, they follow different practices. First, Rav Shalom of Neustadt did not require people at his Seder to wash their hands, meaning he was leading the Seder, he washed his hands, but he did not expect anybody else to do that. But Mahari Segel, that's the Maharil, his student, whenever he had a Seder, he would tell everybody at the Seder that they need to wash their hands. And Mahari Weil did the same thing. That's a very weird opinion. And it turns out, I would have said, if you asked me, who does this today? I don't know. Maybe it says it in some Haggadahs. If you have a Haggadah that says the leader of the Seder washes their hands, okay. But otherwise, you're living in a halachically observant circle, so of course everybody's going to eat. So Karpas, everybody's going to wash their hands. It turns out, Rabbi Spitz quotes, if you compare different Hasidic communities, they have different customs. Sanz, Satmar, Lelav, and Zidichov, following of Rabbi Shmuel Levi Vosner of Bnei Brak, very important Haredi posting of the past generation. No, only the leader of the Seder needs to do Nitzat Yadayim, and they attribute it to the Chatam Sofer as well. He was pretty religious. And in contrast, Belz, Gur, Urchatz, Spinka, Skver, Boyan, and Chabad, they say that everybody washes. And then there's always somebody who's out of the box, or at least in their own box. Vishnitz Minhag is that only once you're married do you wash your hands for Urchatz. I don't know where that came from. I'm sure somebody writes about it, but I didn't find anything. Anyway, just to be aware. Point is that even though the rabbis debated this issue, should it be everybody or just the leader of the Seder, they debated this issue 600 years ago. It turns out that depending on which Hasidic group you go to, either everybody is expected to wash their hands for Urchatz or only the leader of the Seder. But it's very weird because we don't find this in the earlier sources. And if the reason is because, quote, you have to wash your hands if you're about to eat wet food, well then everybody at the Seder of these Hasidim, they're all going to eat Karpas. So how could it be? What's the justification for this custom? We'll come back to this. And now I want to get to the main subject, which is why do we continue to do Urchatz? So if you follow the simple, straightforward approach that we said so far, which is presented by the Taz, one of the main commentaries in the Shulchan Aruch, the reason why we do Urchatz is because you have to wash your hands all year round. And he says this is a rebuke to all the Jews who think they're religious, but they're not so religious because they don't wash their hands for wet food all year round. He says, why should the Seder be any different? Manish Tana Hawaii Mikol Yamim. Kind of gets into a funny joke there. Why is this night different? It isn't. It's not supposed to be different. At the Seder night, everybody should feel themselves rebuked that the whole year round you're supposed to wash your hands when you eat wet food. That's the Taz. And that's why if you ask the Taz, why do we continue to do Urchatz? Reason number one, because it's always required. It's not complicated. Back to the source sheet. It turns out, and this is what I didn't realize, a lot of major Achronim are not happy with that approach. Or in other words, in light of the fact that a bunch of major Rishonim say, really, you don't have to wash your hands for wet food anymore. We don't have rules of purity and impurity. Therefore, that rule no longer applies. So then, okay, why do we continue washing our hands at the Seder? Because as long as you have a traditional Haggadah, it's going to say wash your hands before eating Karpas. If you have, let's say, a Passover Haggadah with drawings by Leonard Baskin from the Central Conference of American Rabbis, that leaves out Urchatz, because if you're Reform, then it doesn't matter that much. Okay, I haven't done research. Perhaps other Reform Haggadahs leave it in, but I understand why somebody who doesn't believe that Jewish law is binding will take that out. Okay, then you can't have the song at the beginning, or maybe you can if nobody understands it. But point is, every traditional Haggadah includes Urchatz. Since most of us do not actually agree with the Taz, and most of our rabbis do not actually agree with the Taz, that you have to wash your hands all year round, therefore, why do we still do it at the Seder? So I'm going to briefly look at two approaches, which start with the understanding that that Urchatz started for purity and impurity, and nevertheless we're going to continue doing it today. And one of them is the major halachic source, the Lavush, in the late 1500s, where he says that even though we Orthodox Jews, whatever, and I know it's anachronistic, halachically observant Jews, we don't follow this rule the whole year round, but because we love Pesach so much, and we want to make the Seder special, so we go above and beyond. We follow a bunch of rules at the Seder that we might not follow the rest of the year. And along those lines, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, major posek from past generation, just died in almost 30 years ago. But he says, on this night when we became sanctified and purified from the Egyptian slavery. Let's leave it at that instead of translating Galut Mitzrayim. Ra'u yoter, it is appropriate, it's preferable to go above and beyond and to follow rules at the Seder that we normally are not obligated to follow. Even at the Seder, we're not obligated to follow it, but the idea is that we're showing God that this is like a special thing. We're showing ourselves that this is a special thing. Special night, we're doing a lot of special things. Okay, so according to this approach, let's go back to the list. Why do we do Urchatz today? According to the Lavush, the Seder is a time to go above and beyond. Urchatz is still based on washing the hands for purity and impurity. Normally, you don't have to follow it, but we do it at the Seder because it's a beautiful idea. A variation of this, which I'm going to list as a separate reason, is because our ancestors always did the Seder this way. This is formulated by the Chida, Reb Chaim Yosef David Azulai, major Sephardi rabbi of the 1700s, and he presents it as a problem in the Shulchan Aruch. He says, I don't understand. I'm summarizing source number 19 here. He says, I don't understand. I want to understand what Rabbi Karo thinks, okay? Rabbi Karo wrote that there's an opinion to follow. You don't have to wash your hands before you eat if you're going to eat less than a kazayit of bread. You have to wash your hands for bread. But if you are going to eat less than an olive size, you don't have to wash your hands. Okay, then he says, okay, Rabbi Karo, how can it be that you, same person, same Shulchan Aruch, you just said that when we do Karpas, we make a point of eating less than a kazayit, but we have to wash our hands beforehand. You just contradicted yourself. It can't be that washing the hands for the purity because of you're touching wet food. It can't be that that's stricter than the classic halacha of washing for bread, and yet you just made it stricter. You don't have to wash for bread if you're eating less than a kazayit of bread, but you do have to wash for karpas if you're eating less than a kazayit of that. So what's going on? So the Chida answers, Lo ratza maran la'akor hanatila. Rav Karo didn't want to uproot the entire thing of Urchatz, meaning Rav Karo, because of reasons that have to do with Karpas, he thought that you should eat less than kazayit of Karpas. So really, as far as his own opinion about washing for wet food, you should not be obligated to wash at all for Urchatz if you're having less than a kazayit. But Kevan dehukba b'chol Yisrael, since Urchatz became a part of the Seder throughout the Jewish world and has been going on for quite a long time, since the time of the Gemara, certainly including this step. Rav Karo didn't want to be the one to say from now on it's out. Really, you could leave it out if you're following Rav Karo and you're eating less than a kazayit of karpas, but Rav Karo says don't. Do it anyway. Why do it anyway? So the way that we're formulating it here is because our ancestors always did it this way, the Chida, because our ancestors always did the Seder this way, all else being equal, we want to do the Seder the same way as our ancestors. Any custom that you have in your family, any custom that of a group of people that you know you're descended from, all else being equal, don't just do the mitzvot of the Seder, do the customs of the Seder, the minhagim, do them in accordance with the way that your ancestors did them. And this is, I'm calling that the third explanation. And now we have an interlude. It's not exactly halftime, but practical differences, meaning practical differences between whether you say that Urchatz is an obligation because of the general rule of washing the hands for wet food, or whether you say, like the two other opinions we just said, opinions 2 and 3, that you don't have to do it, but we do it anyway. And certainly the next 4 opinions we're about to get to, that really Urchatz is for a totally different reason. Well then, Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank, rabbi of Yerushalayim, who died in 1960, says a difference between whether you say it's because of purity, whether you say it's because of another reason is, well then, if it's for another reason, maybe only the head of the Seder needs to do it. If it's connected to purity and washing the hands until you're dying, well then everybody would have to do it. But he wants to justify the custom that we mentioned of only the head of the Seder doing it, that custom presumably is based on the opinions that Urchatz isn't an obligation anyway. It's not a personal obligation, therefore it's okay. This doesn't exactly explain it, but to some extent it justifies it. In that same book, Mikrei Kodesh, Rabbi Frank quotes Rav Chaim Berlin, a son of the Netziv. He has a yeshiva named after him in New York, not to be confused with the institution named after his younger brother. That's here in Israel. His younger brother was Rav Meir Bar Ilan. Get it? Bar Ilan, Bruin. Okay, slightly different institutions. Anyway, Rabbi Chaim Berlin told Rabbi Frank that if you dip the karpas in fruit juice or anything else that's not one of the 7 liquids, presumably you don't have to do urchatz. And let's say you're picking up the karpas not with your hands, but with a spoon or a fork, and you're not touching the vegetable at all. Presumably, you're not obligated to do it as far as the purity rule of Netilat Yadayim. So it must be that one of the other reasons is correct. Meaning, either you say that the main reason why we continue to do urchatz is for some other reason, or just that the reasons for urchatz are connected to purity, and the other reasons as well. Point is that the way some people presenting this approach, I didn't put on the source sheet, say, and that's why you should make sure that you don't dip the karpas in fruit juice, because if you did, then there would be a question about whether you're following the custom. The custom is to dip it in one of the 7 liquids. I mean, really, the custom is either salt water or vinegar. But it's interesting that this turns into a stringency, more rules for karpas, possibly. Maybe you shouldn't pick up the karpas with a fork, because then you wouldn't be obligated to do urchatz, unless you say, no, urchatz is for one of the other reasons. Anyway, just want to mention 2 other practical ramifications possibly. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach says, when everybody goes to the sink to wash, do not remind, if there are women in your family who normally have rings that they take off when they tell you dime for bread, don't remind them to take off their rings. They don't have to take off their rings. Why not? Because Rosh Hashanah Zalman Auerbach, we just saw a couple minutes ago, said the reason for washing, for doing urchatz is to go above and beyond. It's not about the law. Okay, there's a law about netilat yadayim for bread that if the ring is too tight, you're supposed to take it off. But the law doesn't apply here. Therefore, you would not have to take off the rings before doing urchatz. Shmuel Kamenetsky is actually the famous head of the yeshiva of Philadelphia. He's still alive. He's 99. We're turning 99. He says that if you have a bandage on your hand, so you're not going to wash your hands, okay, you're exempt. But then when you're about to eat matzah or bread, whatever, and you can't do netilat yadayim, what are you supposed to do? Put on gloves or wrap a napkin around your hand, whatever. Okay, it's not your fault. You can't wash your hands, but you're still not allowed to touch the bread with your unwashed hands. Therefore, cover your hands. He says you don't have to cover your hands for urchatz. So that's one more example of how a rule of netilat yadayim for bread and matzah does not apply to urchatz if you assume that urchatz is for a reason that's not connected to purity. It could be that these opinions, by the way, are still assuming opinions, reasons 2 or 3 that we saw already. But for sure, these reasons that you don't have to follow the rules of netilat yadayim for bread, you don't have to follow those for urchatz, for sure those would apply according to the next 3 reasons. Okay, the next 4 reasons. Here we go. These reasons assume that we're not washing our hands because of purity. Something else. The Ramah. Yes, that Ramah, who is a major part of the Shulchan Aruch, in his commentary on the Torah, Darkei Moshe, in the context of a discussion in which he says that even if you're German and you follow the custom of doing netilat yadayim before Kiddush, for Shabbat and Yom Tov, don't do that at the Seder. Don't wash your hands before Kaddish. Wash your hands after Kaddish. And part of his explanation is he suggests that you need to wash your hands a little bit closer to Magid because the story of the Haggadah is like a prayer. And there's a halacha that, all else being equal, before you go to the synagogue and you are about to pray, you're supposed to wash your hands. Not 2 or 3 times on each hand. Once on each hand is enough, but the idea is you wash your hands ritually as part of preparing for prayer. So the Ramah says, we wash your hands. We're not preparing for Karpas. Oh, you think you're preparing for Karpas. No, it just happens to be there, meaning the timing is presumably because it used to be for purity. But why do we continue to wash our hands today as part of Urchatz? According to the Ramah, we wash our hands because we're about to say a prayer, a very long prayer. You think that it's just a story. It is a story, but it's also a prayer that praising God for taking us out of Egypt. That's a super out of the box approach. And I've seen a few people quote it, but I have not seen anybody elaborate on this idea at all. I hope to find something about it in the future. Number 5, why should you wash your hands for Urchatz? It's a sign of freedom. There are a bunch of things that we do at the Seder, like, for example, reclining on the left side. That's supposed to be a sign of freedom. It isn't a sign of freedom today. It doesn't matter. When the rabbis instituted reclining, it was a sign of freedom. Therefore, we continue doing it. And he says, perhaps washing the hands before eating food is a sign of freedom because a slave doesn't have time to sit down and prepare and wash their hands. It's cherut and it's srara. Srara is power. Like, I'm a wealthy person. I can eat on my own time. Nobody's making me do anything. And this fits with a custom that some people have mentioned in the Haggadah Beit Levi. Some people have a custom in which, instead of people going to the sink, somebody comes around the table with a bucket. Meaning, even if you're following the custom that only the leader of the Seder does Urchatz, the leader of the Seder does not wash their own hands. Somebody washes their hands for them. So I don't know how common that is, but I did find it in, where are we here? Nope. I did find it in the Open Orthodox Haggadah by Rabbi Shmuel Herzfeld, which has pictures, a lot of drawings by his mom, Carol Herzfeld. And in the drawing, she has pictures of kids bringing a pitcher to the grandparents at the table, and says, hands are washed, but a blessing is not said, and the washing utensils are brought to the head of the household, who is treated like a king or queen. Anyway, an interesting illustration. There aren't that many illustrations about Urchatz, so I thought that was an interesting opinion. Let's go back to the list. Rav Margolies, Rav Reuven Margoliot, same person. He says it's washing the hands for Urchatz is a sign of freedom and power. Okay, 2 more to go. Now, you've heard in a different context that there are a bunch of things that we do at the Seder in order to make the kids ask and say, why are we doing funny things? The Gemara seems to say it about the dipping. Why do we have 2 dippings? In order to make a heker letinokot, meaning do something that children will recognize as unusual, and they'll say, why are you doing that? And you'll say, oh, I'm glad you asked, because we were slaves in Egypt and God took us out, etc. The question, that's said about the 2 dippings. Rabbi Yaakov Reisher, a very important Achron rabbi from the late 1600s, known as the Shvut Yaakov or Chok Yaakov in this case, he says, why do we wash our hands at Urchatz? To do something different. In other words, because we do not normally wash our hands for wet food, it turns into doing it at the Seder. It's not just we're doing the same thing our ancestors do. It turns out that they were doing something unusual. And then the kids will say, hey, what are you doing? And the way formulated slightly differently. Rav Shimon Eider, in his classic Sefer Hilchot Pesach book, says that since during the year after Kiddush we normally wash for bread, when eating the Karpas, the kid will notice something unusual. In other words, hey, we just washed our hands, but we're not eating the matzah now. We're eating something else. What's going on? So that's one way to put it, as opposed to Rabbi Yehuda Spitz of Or Sameach. The way that he quotes this approach from Rav Reisher is that just doing the hand washing itself, because we normally don't do it except for bread, and we're doing it at the Seder for something other than bread, So I guess it's a variation on this idea. And this is not a dat yachid. It's not a lone dissenting opinion, because the Chaya Adam and the Aruch HaShulchan seem to favor this as well. And the Mishnah Berurah even quotes it in passing. So we're going to call this reason number 6. Why do we do Urchatz today, Rav Reisher? So the children will ask about it. And that fits with all sorts of other things at the Seder, doing things so that the children will ask. I see that Rebecca posted, my husband's mother from Alexandria, Egypt, via Israel, has the custom of washing other people's hands. Okay, there you go. That's one application or one specific place that where they did this, to have other people wash your hands, presumably for the freedom and power thing. And David writes, so according to the Chok Yaakov, Urchatz only works because we don't do it the rest of the year, the opposite of what the Taz said. Right, which is why when back here in source number 20, when Tzvi Pesach Frank contrasts, quote, the 2 reasons, I mean, everybody here already knows that there are more than 2 reasons, but he presents the 2 main reasons are the reason of the Taz and the reason of the Chok Yaakov. So because they're, to some extent, they are opposites. Okay. Last opinion. This one is out of the box in a different way, but it's presented by, once again, a major rabbi. This is the Netziv, father of Rav Chaim Berlin and Rav Meir Bar Ilan. He was a Rosh Yeshiva in the Volozhin Yeshiva. He has a commentary on the Haggadah, in which he has, in the old edition anyway, his introduction is 1 page. But on that page, he presents a theory that fits with a bunch of aspects of the Seder. And here's what he says. He says, our ancestors, and specifically the sages, wanted us to do a bunch of things at the Seder in order to imitate what had been done during the time that they had a Karban Pesach, the Paschal Lamb. As we say at the beginning of, near the beginning of Magid, Kol ditzrich yetev yifsach. Everybody who needs, come and eat the Karban Pesach with us. We don't have a Karban Pesach. You're not even allowed to roast the meat as if it were a Karban Pesach. We don't do that anymore, but it doesn't matter. In the same way that this line of the Haggadah is a reminder that there used to be a Karban Pesach, he suggests that several other practices of the Seder are based on that. Like what? Making sure to eat the afikomen before Chatzot. That's because the Karban Pesach needed to be eaten before Chatzot. Afikomen is not really the Karban Pesach. In fact, it's a piece of matzah. It's not a lamb by any stretch of the imagination. But we're eating something instead of the Karban Pesach, and that something has a rule that comes straight out of the Karban Pesach. And then he says, well, I'm going to skip our main point, and then I'll come back to it. He says the kittel. What? Wearing a kittel on Yom Kippur is to remind you of death. Wearing a kittel at the Seder, not everybody does that, but those people who do, he says it's because at the time of the Beit HaMikdash, the kittel was formal wear, and the idea was that this was the most formal meal. You're eating in front of God. You're eating the meal that God commanded everybody to eat, so you wanted to dress up for it. He suggests that's the source of wearing a kittel at the Seder. He says one more point of to separate Hallel into 2 can tie into the Karban Pesach as well, which I'm not going to get into right now. But for our purposes, he says, and that's why we wash our hands for Urchatz. He quotes the Taz, and he says, the Taz says, why? Okay, we wash our hands at the Seder. Doesn't that mean we should wash our hands all year round? And then Siv says, no, it doesn't mean that at all. Because the Seder, we're trying to do things as if it were the time of the Beit HaMikdash when they had the Karban Pesach. At that time, they had the purity laws, okay? So we remind ourselves of the purity laws and of the Beit HaMikdash by washing our hands for Urchatz. That is reason number 7. Then Netziv says to emulate temple times. And I want to conclude with an interesting variation on this reason. Actually, Rabbi Nathan Raufer says the same thing as the Netziv in his book, which is an interesting, basically a long essay called Leading the Passover Journey, the Seder's Meaning Revealed. Rabbi Shlomo Riskin presents the Netziv's approach as well in his Passover Haggadah. But I want to conclude with a book that if I didn't have Rav Yosef Rimon's Haggadah, I would never have found this. Rav Yosef Rimon, who is the Rav of Alun Shavut now and the head of the Beit Midrash at Machon Lev, he has a 2-volume commentary on the Haggadah in Hebrew and in English, in which he quotes different reasons for Urchatz. He only quotes 3 reasons. But one of the reasons that he quotes is the Netziv, and then he brings in one of his teachers, Rav Mordechai Breuer, in his book, Pirkei Moadot, 2 volumes in Hebrew, not translated into English, any of it, as far as I know. He has a whole chapter called Heker with Tinokot, so that the kids will recognize something. And he suggests, and with this we will conclude, he thinks that the Netziv's approach is not really arguing with Rabbi Reisher's approach. Remember, we said Rabbi Reisher is to do you do something different. You wash your hands, so the kids will ask, "Why are you doing that?" And the Netziv says, "Oh, we do it to remind ourselves of the Beit HaMikdash." Rabbi Breuer says these are really 2 sides of the same coin. Really, they're saying the same thing, which is we wash our hands, combining reasons 6 and 7. We wash our hands so that little kids will ask. What are they going to ask? Why are you doing that? And Nashiv Lahem and Hamet will tell them the truth. We will tell them that this Seder that we're doing today is only an abbreviated version of the Seder. It's an imitation Seder. It's not the real thing. Ha'ikar chaser. What used to be the main part of the Seder is not here anymore. And that's why, to remind ourselves of that, we're doing certain things to remind that technically don't apply today, but remind us of what we used to do. And then Rabbi Breuer goes on to say this would also explain the custom of that only the head of the Seder needs to wash his or her hands, because really it's just in order to get the kids to ask, so then the head of the Seder will answer them. It's not for everybody to wash, because all you need is for one person to demonstrate something that used to be done at the time of the Beit HaMikdash. And Rabbi Breuer wraps it up and says, perhaps the other places where the rabbis said, do this so that the kids will ask, it's not what you might think, which is do something ridiculous and stupid that has nothing to do with the Seder at all, but it's just unusual, so the kids will say, what are you doing? No, that's not what it means. Perhaps every one of those places is something that used to be a custom. It's a custom that used to be based on something substantive. The substance isn't there anymore. Why would we continue to do it? We continue to do it in order to, so the kids will ask, and we can tell them that this used to be a substantive part of the Seder. You know, really, we're washing our hands because we're doing the Seder the way that our ancestors did it. But why did they do it? Because they had rules of purity and impurity, which were very important when they used to have the Karban Pesach. So, just to wrap it up, we have seen 7 explanations, which you could really say are 2. The one that says that because you have to wash your hands for wet food, and the other ones. But I prefer to present them as 7 reasons. All 7 of these are well-known rabbis. And until I did the research for this class, I heard of 1, maybe 2 of these 7 explanations. I hope that everybody has gotten something out of this, and that you have something to say at your Seder. I'm going to end the recording now, and I'll stay for questions if anybody wants to ask any questions. So thank you for joining me, and good luck with the rest of your Seder and Pesach preparations.